Canada's new trade deal with the U.S. and Mexico has been under intense scrutiny since Sunday night when negotiators reached an agreement just under the wire. Concessions were made, the most obvious adversely affect Canada's dairy farmers. But Canada also may have given up something else, a chance of a free trade deal with the world's second largest economy. Clause 32 includes something called non-market country free trade agreements. 3 countries fall in that category: Vietnam, North Korea, and China. The clause says that if Canada were to start talks towards a free trade agreement with China, it needs to notify the U.S. and Mexico at least 3 months prior, and Canada must provide as much information as possible regarding the objectives, and if they do reach a deal, Canada will provide the U.S. and Mexico with the full text of the agreement no later than 30 days before the date of signature. Finally, if the U.S. or Mexico doesn't like what it sees, they can terminate the USMCA within 6 months. So how unusual is the clause, and how much power does it really give the U.S.? The CBC's Katie Simpson has been digging into those questions for us, and she joins us now. Hey, Katie.
Hi.
Thanks for being here. So how unusual is it? What are the concerns?
One expert I spoke with today who at one time was advising Prime Minister Justin Trudeau described this move as extraordinary, saying that this clearly is a concession that Canada was prepared to make to the United States because, of course, Donald Trump has made China his biggest trade target. It is no secret he does not like the way that China does trade. And today his top advisors were out speaking to the media saying that this new agreement, the USMCA, is also, in addition to keeping trade going through North America, it's also meant to send a signal to China to start behaving itself. I spoke with Roland Paris, who at one time was advising Prime Minister Trudeau on foreign affairs, and he's the one who says this move is extraordinary.
I think that it is troubling to provide another country with a formal role in vetting Canadian trade negotiations. I think that the United States is sending a message by adding this to the new NAFTA. The message to Canada is watch out, and the message to China, I think, is keep your hands off North America.
Now, he doesn't necessarily think that this is going to have a big adverse effect on Canadian businesses at this time, but he says it's more about the principle. Why is the United States going to be given this, and Mexico as well for that matter, given the power to have some sort of influence on Canada's future trading relationships?
And what about the government? What are they saying about this right now?
The Prime Minister didn't seem to be fazed by questions about this. Obviously, during yesterday's news conference, it came up as well. And Chrystia Freeland tried to say, well, if anyone wants to terminate the trade agreement before, they didn't have to have a reason. But now this is one reason why they could provide it. That sort of explanation is not going over very well with some stakeholders we've been talking to for a story that we're going to do on the National tonight. But here's what the Prime Minister had to say when asked about developing relationships with China today.
Obviously, China is a significant, growing player on global trade, and we, as always, will look for ways to engage, deepen, and improve our trading relationship with them in ways that are beneficial both to Canadians and to everyone.
Canada had wanted to launch formal free trade talks with China late last year. Justin Trudeau headed to Beijing, and they were aiming to have some sort of formal launch of free trade negotiations. However, there were miscommunications between what the Canadian government thought was going to happen, what the Chinese government thought was going to happen. And because of those miscommunications, they weren't able to launch those free trade talks as had been expected. And so Prime Minister Justin Trudeau came home unexpectedly empty-handed on that trip. So that was a concern since the objective was to do more trade and to start this process with China. Overall, this is something the Trudeau government has tried to do. They want to expand trading partners, find new markets. China is one of those markets. So this will certainly cast a new tone over how this process goes.
All right. Thanks a lot, Katie. CBC's Katie Simpson. So why is this clause in the USMCA, and does it mean a free trade deal with China is now off the table? Joining me now is the Minister of Trade Diversification, Jim Carr. Minister Carr, pleasure to have you back. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure to be back.
Does this effectively give the U.S. a veto over a free trade deal with China for Canada?
We talk to the Chinese all the time. We'll continue to talk to the Chinese. We have all kinds of aspirations for a closer relationship. As a matter of fact, it's interesting, the 2 stories that you led with off the top, because we're talking today about a $40 billion investment from a consortium that is going to make Canada a very important player in the international LNG market. Much of that product ultimately will end up in Asia. We will be replacing coal with what will one day be the cleanest LNG in the world. This is a very good news story, and that will be a part of our trading relationships with the Asia Pacific. And no one is telling us that we can't make deals. We are making deals, and it will be the benefit of Canada.
Are they saying, though, that you can make those deals, but if you want to make a formal deal, a formal free trade agreement deal with China, that's a no?
No, there are notifications there, but you have to remember, Vashi, that in the current NAFTA agreement and in its successor, any of the parties to the agreement can give 6 months' notice for whatever reason they want to get out of the deal. That's to protect.
So why put this clause in there specifically?
That's to protect us against developments that may not be in Canada's interests. So that clause is there. It was there before. Nothing that has happened over the last couple of days will impinge on Canadian sovereignty.
There was no real indication, though, from the federal government that this was even a consideration leading up until Sunday.
This is a complex deal that's been negotiated over a period of 14 months, and you never know until the very end what finally will be in the deal. Because what happens between the time you start talking and the time you stop talking is that bottom lines begin to emerge, and they did emerge, and we were satisfied that the deal was good for Canada. And by the way, opinions that range from Jerry Diaz to Brian Mulroney and a lot of people in between yesterday and today have said that this is a good deal for Canada. And you have to look at the deal in its entirety to conclude whether or not it's in the national interest.
But that doesn't preclude you, I think, from examining some of the clauses that were
no, of
not
course,
made
and people
public
are.
in the lead-up.
No, and people will examine clauses for many months to come.
And this one was brought to the public's attention not only vis-a-vis the release of the text, but today we have Larry Kudlow, an economic advisor to the president, saying, honestly, I think it sends a signal to China that we are acting as one, and I think that's very good. Is that what the federal government here wanted?
People send signals, they send messages, and others receive those messages. The point that I want to make is that Canada has given up no sovereignty. Canada will continue to do business with those countries with whom we have relationships. It's not only this North American agreement we're talking about. We just celebrated the first anniversary of CETA with the European Union. We have introduced legislation that's moving quickly through Parliament, the CPTPP. We're having conversations with Mercosur countries in South America. We're talking to the Pacific Alliance. We'll continue to do that. In spite of the relationship that we have developed and this new agreement that we think is good for the country, we're looking beyond the hemisphere. We're looking to the Asia Pacific and to Europe and to South America, and we'll continue to do that because an expansion of our markets is good for Canada because trade produces wealth, and that ends up very important to the people who elect me or don't elect me, depending on how well they think I'm doing, in Winnipeg South Centre, and that is to create jobs for Canadians.
Is the federal government still pursuing a formal free trade agreement or the big talks that will lead to one with China?
The federal government continues to have talks with China, not only talks with China, but also there are business deals with China that are happening all the time.
I understand that, but I'm trying to parse apart because this clause relates to an FTA, not just developing a bigger trade relationship with China. The government was at one point interested in starting those talks. As Katie mentioned, the trip happened, the beginning of those talks were not announced. Is that still being pursued?
We continue to do important business with China. We want to deepen our economic relationships with China. They are a large and important market for Canada. They have the capacity to help us create more jobs in our country, and we'll continue to do whatever we can to create more of those jobs.
With respect, that doesn't answer the question about whether there's anything formal being pursued.
There's nothing formal right now.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask
You're
you,
welcome.
let me switch to NAFTA then and ask you,
Sure.
Why didn't the government hold out for exemptions under the 232 tariffs on aluminum and steel before signing the deal?
Well, you have to compare the agreement to the positions that were announced by the American administration 14 months ago. Compare where we are now to where we started, and the progress has been enormous. At the beginning of the discussions, the American administration wanted to dismantle supply management. There was
I don't think they ever said they wanted to totally get rid of supply management.
That certainly was the implication, and that was the position that many people believed to be their opening one. And you can follow it all the way through the various points of agreement that we announced over the last number of days. You look at the agreement that was made on autos, it's very significant. Canada sends 2 million automobiles to the United States now, tariff-free up to 2.6 million.
You got exemptions on 232 for autos, but not for steel and aluminum.
Still talking about that. Everything was not determined. This is a continuing conversation. We think where we landed yesterday is good for Canada, and we're very encouraged by other people who are giving comments across the country today from various sectors of the economy, from the workers to the entrepreneurs to the associations to premiers. And we think that we found a place where Canadians are comfortable.
The steelworkers called it a sellout. I know there are, I'll give you that there are a lot of people commending it, but the steelworkers are worried about their future.
Well, you can zero in on one comment and I can zero in on another. The point is that the negotiators, and we have the finest negotiators in the world, determined at the end of the negotiation that these items were best for Canada. And I think that we will see that we have maintained important access for our most important trading partner. My own province of Manitoba, $8.9 billion of exports a year. 71% of exports out of Manitoba go to the United States. And we think that while we solidify that hemispheric relationship, as we expand our export markets, the result will be good for Canada, and that means more good jobs for Canadians.
When will farmers find out how and when they're getting compensated?
We're having a continuing conversation. The Prime Minister has said, Minister Freeland has said, I say now that farmers who are impacted will be fully compensated.
When?
I'm sure the talks are going on right now.
Is there any kind of, I mean, and I am getting a lot of questions from, and I'm being honest, from dairy farmers who are concerned that they were not given a timeline with TPP, the new CPTPP. Is this happening in the next 6 months, in the next 3 months?
The government is determined to be fair to the producers, and will make good on that fair promise.
So no timeline.
We'll make good on that fair promise.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, Minister Carr. Great to see you again.
Okay.
Part of Canada's concessions in this deal was to include language that holds Canada hostage to the Americans if we decide to trade with another country. No wonder the Minister of Foreign Affairs tried to downplay questions about this yesterday. Experts have called this concession a severe restriction on Canadian independence and capability, and that the Americans are trying to control our trade.
Canada retains full sovereignty and complete control over our trade relations.
Well, the champagne is flowing at the Trump Tower today, Mr. Speaker. They gave Trump a veto power over our other trade deals.
Before we got this deal, what we were hearing from the Conservatives is that we needed to start surrendering as quickly as possible.
The dissection of the new trade deal with the United States continues today. There were, of course, many questions about Canada's concessions. One that is raising some eyebrows is a clause that would force Canada to give the U.S. and Mexico a heads up when negotiating any trade deals with, quote, non-market countries, which includes China. Is this a veto, as the Conservatives are calling it, or is Canada's sovereignty intact, as Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland says? It's time for the Power Panel. In Toronto, Amanda Alvaro of Pomp and Circumstance, and next to her, Chad Rogers of Crestview Strategy. Here with me in studio, political commentator and former NDP MP Françoise Bovin, and Evan Dyer of CBC News. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you. Amanda, I'm going to start with you. Is it a veto?
No, it's not. And this is what's crazy about this is that it doesn't look that different from what was formerly known as the NAFTA agreement. I think what people are taking issue with is this 6-month withdrawal clause, which actually existed in the former agreement. And the way that it's being positioned is if Canada is the one who has to disclose when looking at a free trade agreement with a non-market economy and the other parties aren't subject to the same thing is just flat out wrong.
Well, I don't think the U.S. is pursuing an FTA with China.
But it doesn't matter. If they were going to, it's absolutely reciprocal amongst all parties in the agreement. You can withdraw just like you could under the NAFTA agreement. So this is one of those things where the Conservative Party is digging into a little nugget and trying to make a mountain out of a molehill.
Chad, what do you think?
Look, I spent the day in downtown Toronto with lots of business people. They're awfully happy that we're closer to the finish line. If I have to be political about it, I'm not worried about the government's previous rush to try and have a trade agreement with China. I think any cooling element on that is good. China is not a fair free market partner. And I think the entire resolution of this NAFTA saga is like the Gimli glider, the plane that ran out of power that they just slowly landed safely in Manitoba. And it was a victory of a plane crash. crash. No one was hurt. This whole negotiation has been a plane crash with survivors. It was a victory of a horrible outcome.
Evan, it's not just, I take their point that the opposition is saying a lot about it, but it was also Roland Paris, who's a former advisor, foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister. Katie interviewed him earlier today. He was saying it's extraordinary that, I take again the point around the 6-month withdrawal, but that it's tied directly to China.
No, and I take his point, and you have to think another non-market economy, according to the U.S., is Vietnam. Well, Vietnam's a member of the TPP. If this clause had been in effect when we were negotiating the TPP, and the U.S. pulled out of the TPP, what would it have meant for that? So there is a legitimate question there, but I think at the same time, you can't negotiate a trade agreement without giving up some of your sovereignty. There isn't one that doesn't involve a give of some sovereignty, right? The old NAFTA did. You know, Chapter 11 was definitely a giveaway of our sovereignty, and it cost Canada a lot of money. It opened Canada to be sued just for passing laws that we thought were in the public interest, and we paid as a consequence of those lawsuits hundreds of millions of dollars. And actually, let's point out that this new USMCA, I've heard somebody call it.
I can't even remember it.
USMCA, we're going to call it that. So the new agreement got rid of Chapter 11 for us, but it remains to some extent for Mexico. So the government could say, well, we've actually recovered some of our sovereignty, both on that and on the proportionality agreement, which has also gone from the new NAFTA. And not only that, but by holding out, we got a better deal than Mexico, which is still subject to being sued by U.S. companies in the energy sector alone. Only in that sector, but it still has some of Chapter 11 hanging over it.
Do you think, Françoise, that this is kind of the nail in the coffin of a formal pursuit of a formal free trade agreement with China? There had been issues, all along. And we know that the Prime Minister visited there last year, but came home without an announcement, essentially signaling the start of those talks.
I think the message from the U.S. is pretty clear. We're not too keen on dealing with China, and if you want to be our friend, it's very hard to be the friend of the other. And it's nothing different than if you're having a party at your place and you know two people don't like each other. You might tell them, by the way, I'm inviting this one, and nobody will be surprised, and then you have a decision to make if you're going or not. The only thing I like about kind of the bickering that we're hearing at question period, because that's what question period is about, is at the same time it gives us a bit of information, because not everybody is going to read the whole treaty. And by every day we learn something. Today we learn about pharmaceutical, we learn a bit about China, so I think it's good for our democracy to have the full portrait. I wish it was the government coming out instead of just spewing some kind of Boy Scout or Girl Scout type of rhetoric. It's fantastic. There was nothing a week ago, but now we solved everything and everything is great. And just say, listen, here's the picture. Here's what we've negotiated. Here's what's left. There's still some negotiations to happen. Even EU is not completed yet. So it's a long process. A lot of people will talk about it for a long, long time. But the bottom line, I think, economically, there's a lot of people who are in the business community who are happy now. Not totally ecstatic, but happy that finally we can sit at the same table as somebody who's been called a bully like Donald Trump and not be the enemy at the table. I think it's not a role that Canada liked to have.
I think, and I'll play a clip right now, because I think Mr. Trump, President Trump, was talking about the deal again today. Have a listen.
New trade agreement is called the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, like YMCA or United States Marine Corps with an A at the end. I like the way it sounded.
So finally, I have a trick to remember this name. Amanda, what do you think about the way, what's left, I guess, what challenges are left for the federal government in selling this deal going forward, and where those challenges exist?
Well, interestingly, somebody told me that, yesterday was a day where more people tuned in and ratings were highest and Canadians we're actually really engaged in some of the details. And I think that that's surprising to some people. I think people think that, you know, they hear terms like NAFTA or USMCA, YMCA, however he described it, and they tune out because it feels like it's too big and it's too broad and it's too all-encompassing, and that just really hasn't been the case. Canadians actually do care about the details. So I agree with some of the comments that my fellow panelists have made today. I think it's really important and incumbent on the government to continue to dish out some of those details. Not just spell out the fact that it's been a win, and it has been a win. And is it a good deal? Yes, it's a good deal. Is it a perfect deal? Absolutely not. But name one that is. But I think it is important for them to spell out the details because I think that there's an engaged Canadian public who wants to know more.
Chad, you're kind of raising your eyebrows, shaking your head. How am I to interpret that?
Well, we've got to get the deal approved, so it's not done yet. So let's not run the full victory lap yet. Secondly, we've still got steel tariffs to deal with, and that's something that has an immediate impact on Canadian jobs, Canadian wealth creation. So while the market is rewarding stability, the value of the dollar, the market performance in the last 2 days, we've still got a couple of pretty big pieces in play in terms of our negotiations, so we can't take our eye off the ball.